Hi everyone, David Fazzino here, and I'd like to welcome you back for our final screencast for the Anthropology and World Problems class being offered at Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania. The topic for this screencast is on global and local solutions and sustainability. And so some big questions that we get to, in terms of conceptualizing sustainability. We talked about that earlier in the semester in looking at approaches to the environment. And we can also think about what alternatives might look like to the current state of affairs. There have been some commentators that have suggested that a particular world order is the world order and that there is no alternative to that. This goes back until at least the 1980s with the Reagan and Thatcher era. So what overall is the outlook for the future? And potentially you are an optimist, maybe a technological optimist, maybe you are an optimist along other lines in terms of conceptualizing things like social equity and justice and how that might work its way through the entire system. But often in anthropology, we talk about this outlook for the future in terms of how it's framed. And so we get potential utopian and dystopian futures. And a fine example of this is the recently revealed line that's, again, supposed to take this mega city essentially in the desert spread out with mirrored walls. And, some commentators are looking at this in Saudi Arabia as, this great development. And other folks are saying, wow, this is a real potential for a dystopian type of world. And indeed, science fiction films and popular media as well, dating back quite a ways, talk about these futures and how it's conceptualized overall. So one of the things to think about too is what is the most pressing world problem we have faced today, and how has that changed over time? How has that changed over time in terms of what we know about the world, in terms of our footprint in the world, in terms of globalization, resource extraction, fossil fuel burning, social justice and equity issues, as well as reporting on that across the globe. Again, globalization can be many different things in many different contexts in looking at both exacerbating negative aspects as well as potentially offering solutions as well. And then the question that we've asked throughout this class overall is how do we conceptualize or understand world problems? And this is part of critical thinking. So depending on the lens that we might look at this through, potentially this is along lines of social inequality. And so we might locate this in one particular area like class or race or gender, but we might also look at intersectionalities here. We might frame these issues in terms of livelihood issues, the right to food, the right to a safe and healthy environment, the right to be free from hunger, the right to have employment. We also might think about the right of the freedom of movement. But of course, as we've seen in many of these sections, there is much to consider in each of these elements. Environmental destruction, potentially also war, terrorism, weapons of mass destruction. And so in this world, who can act and what should be done and what can be done? And a lot of this is how Wolfgang Sachs has framed the issues out in looking at things like the contest perspective, the astronaut perspective, and the home perspective that we saw in the approaches to the environment section. So what does it mean to have corporations take the lead? What does it mean to have nonprofit organizations take the lead in the face of potential retreat of the state that we've talked about in a variety of different contexts throughout these screencasts? Potentially global institutions, multilateral institutions, international organizations like the United Nations and the various entities that comprise the United Nations in terms of organizations which are focused on specific aspects of global issues and global problems. Potentially, these solutions can be offered through multiple different individuals and agencies as well as entities at multiple scales. So what for the future? This idea of dystopian futures. This is an imaginary place where people are unhappy and usually afraid because they are not treated fairly. And we see quite a bit of this, of course, in media, in entertainment, right? So this, books, written accounts, a lot of sci-fi films. One of the earliest references I saw to this was Rosling's Universal Robots in 1920, essentially the robots turning on humanity. And of course, we've seen several reboots of this in terms of how instruments of our salvation become instruments of our destruction. Also, in terms of sci-fi and films that cover these topics and write about these futures and conceptualize them, we also can think about agency and non-human agency and what robotics might tell us about this. Donna Haraway has written quite a bit about this in terms of cyborgs. So too has Arturo Escobar. And so what do we mean here in the context of being cyborgs? And so part human, part machine. And we can think about the things like this class, for example, that is computer-mediated distance education, asynchronous class. That you might be accessing through your smartphone. And you might think about how often you look at your devices. And of course, now we have this as a measure of wellness in terms of how much you're picking up your device, what apps you're looking at, what your screen time is overall. Probably one of the more famous written examples of a dystopian future that we covered in an earlier section on the class is George Orwell's 1984. So very dystopian, Big Brother is watching you type of future. And indeed, much of this class, we've talked about some fairly difficult topics that involve suffering on a variety of scales. And so, and when we consider what those trends look like too, this doesn't necessarily lead to the greatest sense of optimism. Just as we can imagine very bleak futures, so too can our species imagine very bright futures. And so this idea of utopia, this imaginary place in which government laws and social conditions are perfect. Of course, the plot of many sci-fi films is basically to turn potential utopias on their head. This idea of this idealistic, indefinitely out of reach type of future that's never quite achieved. So if we break it down and think about some of the potential actors, in terms of corporate actors, certainly under Wolfgang Sachs's market approach, we've seen ways that there have been efforts to focus on sustainability and indeed market sustainability. We also, in the context of corporations, we see shareholder activism. We also see a number of green initiatives arising, recycling initiatives, organic food movement. Of course, this is quite dramatic growth in organic agriculture in the United States, one of the fastest growing sectors in the food industry for the last 2 decades. Of course, also we think about the social equity implications of this, and as we mentioned this before, this idea of representation in California's alternate food movement, particularly in farmers markets, and Julie Guthman's work, If They Only Knew, discusses that. We also see the presence of social responsibility as a marketing tool, so fair trade, coffee, chocolate, wine, other goods that market their products around a price premium that is paid by the consumer for this increased amount given to farmers. So again, going back in the context of economic anthropology, we think about things like gift and commodity exchanges and how these things are wrapped up, how you're not just necessarily buying the product, but you're also buying this feeling that comes along with the product. We might also think about how, when we're serving food to our friends or somebody that we're just meeting, and, how we might frame that food. This is from this location and it is fair trade, it is organic. And, in saying that, that also says something about you, of course, as well. One of the critiques of this type of marketing overall has been that much of these efforts have been towards public relations aspects and greenwashing. The "This is a generic brand" video is a nice demonstration of that. And of course, the connection with the state overall to foster trade. And of course, we see this in terms of political economy overall, and the idea that free trade is also utopic, right? It is seemingly out of reach because the state is always there in some way. If we think about things like the formal economy, for example, which is how you get to gross domestic product, the state is always there in some way regulating trade in some form or fashion. Or even ensuring safe transport and what that looks like across borders. In an early example from economic anthropology, Paul Bohannon's 1955 work on the TIV looked at exchange and investment. The TIV live in southern Nigeria, and the economy is divided into 3 spheres of exchange. And what Bohannon noted was that it was conceivable to organize the economy according to a moral hierarchy of values, where all values are not commensurable. And we talked about that they can't necessarily change hands with one another. They're not necessarily equivalents because they're morally differentiated. But when money comes in, and particularly general purpose money, what this does is it collapses these systems. So it results in a generalized interchangeability of all things through this single metric. And so the value of something becomes, what is the value in terms of this currency? And so this increased opportunities for and the scope of unequal exchange. So Hornborg draws from this early work on the TIV of Paul Bohannon and looks at basically what we can learn from the TIV. And looking at this in terms of sustainability and a sustainable economy, Hornborg argues that perhaps we can adopt some aspects of the TIV economy in local exchange trading systems. And so Hornborg notes, to pave the way for industrial capitalism, the ideology and science of economics made unequal exchange of labor and land invisible by conditioning us only to think in terms of money. The current agricultural policies could be replaced, according to Hornborg, with a system where it's rational for humans to participate in sustainable production and consumption overall. Hunn's 1999 work, The Value of Subsistence for the Future of the World, found in Virginia Nazarea's Ethnoecology book, discusses the importance of fourth world societies. So these are nations within nations, native North America, such as the Tohono, for example. Traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, also known as indigenous ecological knowledge, embodies the cultural diversity of the species. And for Hunn, this is really equivalent to this idea of survival of humanity as a whole. And so when we lose cultures, we lose the knowledge that is unique to those particular cultures. And this is a parallel that's been drawn by several commentators in terms of linguistic diversity, biological diversity, and cultural diversity, is that we're essentially burning knowledge, or we're losing knowledge, and we're losing knowledge that's embedded in a particular place. And the concern that Eugene Hunn raises in this is that in the cultural sets, we may be left with just one, the global capitalist consumer society. So Hunn is basically arguing for the continued existence of subsistence-based communities that represent choices for our future. Following Marx, he notes that the root of our present predicament lies in the mass alienation of human beings from the work of subsistence on their own land. And of course, this is an ongoing trend with urbanization, and also if you think about types of jobs and opportunities, as well as individual economic, personal, and family trajectories overall.